I'm going to give some biographical background on Frederick Douglass to complement what you've read in the head notes. First, I want to talk a little bit about how different Douglass is from our preceding authors. So I'd like you to write some dates down, but don't worry, you don't have to memorize these dates. It's just going to help you place our works in a historical context. So the first date is 1756, when Equiano says he was brought to Virginia from Africa. And we know he'll later go on to England, but right now I'm focusing on his time in America. The next date, 1761, when Wheatley was brought to Boston, Massachusetts from Africa. 1766, Equiano purchased his own freedom in the West Indies. In 1773, Wheatley published her poems in England and then was given freedom in America. And then in 1789, Equiano published his narrative. Now let's leave a little gap after those dates and then fill in some relevant dates for Frederick Douglass. So in 1818, he was born in Maryland. In 1838, he escapes from slavery. And in 1845, he publishes his narrative. So right away, you might notice some differences between our 18th century authors and our first 19th century author. So one, Douglass was born in America, not in Africa. And that's because there had been a major change between the 18th and 19th century. In 1807, the slave trade had been abolished in England and the United States followed suit. So this is, what Equiano was working so hard to achieve. It takes place in 1807 and goes into effect in January of 1808. And this doesn't end the institution, but it ends the trade of enslaved people from Africa. And it brought a relatively quick ending to slavery in the English colonies, which had a high mortality rate and a low birth rate. They ended the institution in 1832. But the United States was able to continue for several more decades because its enslaved population increased more through birth than importation. So that's another difference with Douglass. He was born into slavery. He was not captured like Wheatley and Equiano. And another big difference is that Douglass is born at a time when America was an independent country. Now, even though Equiano published his narrative after American independence, the parts of his narrative that take place in America are during the colonial period. But Douglass was born into an America liberated from British rule. And on page 374 of his narrative, you see him comparing himself to the American revolutionary Patrick Henry in the cry, "Give me liberty or give me death." Now, Douglass eventually achieved liberty with the help of his fiancée, Anna Murray. And she got him money and the uniform and identification papers of a free Black merchant sailor. And he was able to take a series of trains and ferries from Baltimore in the slave state of Maryland to New York, in New York City in the free state of New York. And Anna followed a few days behind him, and the two were married in New York. He changed his last name from Bailey to Johnson to avoid detection. And he eventually chose the last name Douglass after the hero of a poem from Scottish author Sir Walter Scott. And he and Anna worked to advance the cause of abolitionists. In his own day, Douglass was most famous as an orator, and he delivered powerful speeches advocating for an end to slavery. But he was also a writer and wrote his autobiographies in the abolitionist tradition. So that's an artistic feature that he shares with Equiano. They're both writing in the abolitionist tradition. And also like Equiano, he wrote after he was free, and he used the same genre, the slave narrative. But Douglass's is what we call a fugitive slave narrative, because he was a fugitive or runaway. His freedom wasn't given to him like Wheatley's, nor did he first buy himself like Equiano. He ran away. And after he published his narrative, there was fear that he'd be recaptured and sent back to the South. So he went on a tour of Europe, and he and his fellow abolitionists raised $711 to pay off his owners. And this was a very controversial move because many felt that that legitimized the idea that his former masters owned him. But they felt it was too great a risk not to. You know, what a prize that would be for slaveholders to recapture, you know, the great Frederick Douglass. But it doesn't diminish the fact that he took his freedom first. So he established an anti-slavery newspaper, which he named the North Star. And as I mentioned when discussing the image at the beginning of our course Canvas site, Aaron Douglas's painting Aspiration, the North Star guided many runaways on their journey and became a powerful symbol of freedom in the African American community. Douglass discusses the star on page 374 as he begins to develop his aspirations to find liberty in the North. In addition to working for African Americans' freedom and rights, Douglass also advocated for women's rights. In 1848, he was the only African American to attend the Seneca Falls Conventions for women's rights. Now, like Wheatley and like Equiano, it seemed that Douglass had it better than other enslaved people. He did domestic and shipbuilding labor more often than agricultural labor. He was not frequently beaten. He was taught the alphabet and was able to later teach himself how to read. But I do not want you to think that this treatment was normal. So Wheatley, Equiano, and Douglass are in some ways representative of the enslaved African American population, but the very fact that they all got freedom, the very fact that they all learned to write and could tell about their experiences makes them exceptional. So we have to remember that for every freed enslavement person writing about his or her experiences, there are millions who can't get out and who are crushed under unimaginable torture, and they can never write and alert the world to their story as our authors are doing.